Before 1947 there was no India and no Pakistan, only a subcontinent that had survived countless empires and countless contradictions. For centuries it existed as a tapestry of languages, religions, economies and cultures, often conflicting, often coexisting. But it was not until the arrival of British colonialism that identity itself was turned into a weapon. The British East India Company did not arrive in India to govern. It came to extract, to plunder spices, textiles, and eventually people. But as the company grew richer and more entrenched, it also grew more paranoid. The 1857 rebellion, often called the First War of Independence, was a violent reminder that the colonial enterprise was not welcome forever. It was a moment when Hindu and Muslim soldiers, workers, and peasants rose together. And that unity terrified the empire more than anything else. After crushing the revolt with overwhelming force, the British drew their most enduring lesson: never allow the oppressed to unite. And so began the strategy of divide and rule. This wasn't just rhetoric. It was policy. The colonial state began codifying identity, classifying communities, assigning religious labels and censuses, and mapping populations not as people, but as data points of division. Religion, which had always existed in overlapping ways across the region, became rigid. The British administration encouraged the formation of religious organizations, loyal elites, and intermediaries that would represent their communities to the state. Then came the political weaponization of identity. In 1909, the British introduced separate electorates for Muslims. Under the pretext of representation, Muslims could now vote only for Muslim candidates in separate constituencies. Far from empowering minorities, this system institutionalized division. The act taught generations to view politics not through class, labor, or shared struggle, but through religious affiliation. This process was not accidental, it was structural. The 1935 Government of India Act expanded this logic, reinforcing separate political tracks for different religious groups. Elections, instead of uniting the colonized in anti-imperial struggle, now divided them into electoral silos. A Muslim vote, a Hindu vote, a Sikh vote, each boxed and branded. In the emerging political landscape, nationalists on both sides were forced to play the communal game. The Indian National Congress, despite its secular veneer, could not entirely resist the temptation to appeal to Hindu identity. The All India Muslim League increasingly portrayed itself as the only voice for Muslims, erasing the many leftist and secular Muslim perspectives that didn't fit its narrative. But there were voices of resistance. Revolutionary thinkers like Bhagat Singh, who was hanged at just 23, imagined a free India not defined by religion but by class struggle. He rejected both Hindu nationalism and Muslim communalism. For him, the enemy was not a religion but the system, colonial capitalism, that kept workers in chains and peasants in debt. The early Indian communists, along with anarchists, trade unionists, and radical student groups, attempted to build unity not around gods, but around grain, wages, and justice. These movements were powerful, but short-lived. The British cracked down hard on the left. Leaders were jailed, newspapers banned, labor strikes suppressed. By the 1940s, with the empire collapsing under its own contradictions and the pressure of World War II, the dominant voices that remained were communal ones. The dream of a united, class-conscious independence had been snuffed out, or at least sidelined. And so, when partition came, it didn't fall from the sky. It was not just the tragic result of irreconcilable religious differences. It was the final act of a political script written in colonial ink, a script where identity was fractured, solidarity was suppressed, and nationalism became the only vocabulary left. By the time the British Empire decided to quit India, it had already ensured that its exit would be marked not by unity, but by chaos. Partition is often described in textbooks as a neat event. A line drawn on a map. A transfer of power. 2 flags raised, 1 lowered. But for those who lived through it, partition was not a moment, it was a catastrophe. Over 14 million people were displaced almost overnight. Hindus and Sikhs moving from what became Pakistan into India, and Muslims from India heading toward the new state of Pakistan. It was the largest mass migration in human history, and it happened in a matter of weeks. Trains packed with refugees arrived at their destinations with no survivors. Whole villages were erased. Women were raped, abducted, traded. Children were orphaned. The violence was not incidental. It was structural, embedded in the rushed, careless manner of British withdrawal and fueled by years of religious polarization. But what's often ignored in nationalist histories is that partition was not just the birth of 2 nations, it was the death of a shared world. Farmers who had tilled the same land for generations suddenly became outsiders. Workers who had built the same railways, lived in the same towns, and spoken the same languages were divided by borders they had no role in creating. For the elite, partition was a project negotiated in drawing rooms, in Delhi, London, and Lahore. But for the poor, it was a rupture lived on foot, in camps, on roads strewn with corpses. While politicians debated boundaries, peasants fled for their lives. In Pakistan, the emerging ruling class consolidated power quickly. A bureaucracy inherited from the British, a military establishment elevated as the guardian of the new state, and a capitalist elite enriched by the assets left behind by fleeing Hindus. In India, power transferred to the Congress Party and its allies, many of whom adopted a socialist language, while protecting landlord interests and suppressing radical peasant movements. Nowhere in this transition did the working class gain true power. Land reform remained incomplete. Labor unions were sidelined. Refugees were promised rehabilitation but found exploitation. In many cases, the same systems of oppression that had existed under colonialism, class hierarchy, caste discrimination, patriarchal violence, were merely inherited and rebranded by the new nation-states. Partition also fractured the subcontinent's leftist movements. The Communist Party, once united across India, was forced to split. Class-based solidarity was weakened by national loyalty. Revolutionaries who had once envisioned a united anti-colonial future were now trapped behind borders, silenced by the urgency of nation-building. And in that silence, the memory of partition was slowly twisted. Rather than being remembered as a human tragedy driven by elite failures, it was recast as a story of national sacrifice, religious revenge, and patriotic birth. The pain of ordinary people was reduced to numbers, their trauma buried beneath flag-waving mythologies. But partition was not inevitable. It was not demanded by ancient hatreds, as we are so often told. It was engineered, by empire, by elite negotiations, and by those who saw power more clearly in division than in solidarity. If we are to understand the conflict between India and Pakistan, not just the wars and the rhetoric but the enduring tension, we must begin here, with the betrayal of a shared future and the suffering of those whose voices were never heard. In the years following partition, both India and Pakistan faced political instability, economic strain, and the emotional wreckage of mass migration. But rather than focus inward, on rebuilding broken lives, on healing divisions, both states turned outward. And so began the cycle of wars, 1947, 1965, 1971, and beyond. The first war came almost immediately after independence. In 1947, tribesmen from Pakistan's northwest frontier province, supported by Pakistani forces, invaded Kashmir. The Maharaja of Kashmir, a Hindu ruler in a Muslim-majority state, acceded to India in return for military protection. War broke out. Thousands died. And when the guns fell silent, Kashmir was divided, administered by both countries, claimed by both, and owned by neither. From the very beginning, war served a political purpose. In Pakistan, it was used to legitimize the military and frame the new nation as the defender of South Asia's Muslims. In India, it was used to assert national unity in a time of internal turmoil and communal tension. But in both cases, war functioned as something more dangerous, a distraction. In 1965, both countries again clashed over Kashmir. The result? Stalemate. Thousands of lives lost, economies strained, no territorial change. But nationalism thrived. War allowed governments to rally populations under the flag, to silence dissent, and to reframe internal failures as external threats. Then came 1971, a war with devastating consequences. In what was then East Pakistan, the Bengali population demanded autonomy, equality, and recognition of their language and culture. The Pakistani military responded with mass violence, killings, rapes, and displacement on an unimaginable scale. India intervened militarily, and within weeks, Pakistan's eastern half became a new nation, Bangladesh. Once again, the tragedy of war was reduced to national narratives. In Pakistan, it became a story of betrayal and humiliation. In India, a story of righteous intervention and military success. But few talked about the actual people, the Bengali peasants and workers caught in the crossfire of geopolitical power games. Across all these wars, one pattern is clear: the dead were always the poor. The soldiers came mostly from working-class families. The displaced were landless farmers. The wounded were rarely treated in presidential palaces or colonial bungalows. War was a tool of the elite, paid for in the blood of the forgotten. And while nationalism soared, inequality deepened. In Pakistan, military spending exploded, even as millions lived without access to healthcare or education. In India, successive governments used external threats to justify surveillance, crackdowns on dissent, and the crushing of labor strikes and student movements. There were no winners in these wars, only arms dealers, generals, and politicians who found power in permanent hostility. The ordinary people of both countries? They gained nothing but graves, slogans, and silence. So when we talk about the wars between India and Pakistan, we must resist the temptation to speak in terms of victory and defeat. These were not battles of liberation. They were the symptoms of deeper failures. Failures to build just societies, failures to resolve grievances, and above all, failures to imagine peace. Kashmir is often described as a disputed territory, a phrase that reduces millions of lives to a map and a border. But Kashmir is not just a conflict between two states. It is a wound, deep, painful, and constantly reopened. And for the people who live there, it has become a prison built by history, nationalism, and silence. When partition divided the subcontinent in 1947, princely states were asked to join either India or Pakistan. Kashmir, a Muslim-majority region ruled by a Hindu monarch, became the epicenter of crisis. Under pressure, the Maharaja signed the instrument of accession to India. Pakistan called it illegal. India sent troops. The people were barely consulted. And just like that, Kashmir was militarized, its future sealed not by democracy but by rifles. Today, India controls the majority of Jammu and Kashmir. Pakistan holds a portion it calls Azad Kashmir. But in both cases, the lived experience for ordinary Kashmiris has been one of occupation, militarization, and fear. For decades, Kashmiris have demanded the right to self-determination, a promise made at the United Nations never fulfilled. Instead, they have received bullets, curfews, surveillance, and impunity. In the 1990s, a violent insurgency erupted in Indian-administered Kashmir. The Indian state responded with overwhelming force. Mass arrests, disappearances, torture, and collective punishment. Human rights reports tell of unmarked graves, mass rapes, and the normalization of state violence. But this isn't a story of good versus evil. Pakistan, too, has treated Kashmir more as a geopolitical tool than a humanitarian concern. It has supported militant groups under the banner of liberation, while silencing dissent and controlling its administered regions with an iron grip. The people of Gilgit-Baltistan and so-called Azad Kashmir often lack full constitutional rights. Their voices, like their Indian-administered counterparts, are marginalized. And yet, both states continue to claim they speak for Kashmir, while refusing to listen to Kashmiris. From a leftist lens, Kashmir is not just a territorial dispute. It's a textbook example of how nationalism suppresses human rights, how militaries grow stronger by manufacturing enemies, and how ordinary people, especially the poor, bear the brunt of policies crafted far away. The victims are not only those who die from bullets, but also those who live in permanent fear. Farmers whose orchards are raided. Children who grow up under surveillance. Women subjected to violence and stigma. And youth whose dreams are limited to survival. In 2019, India revoked Article 370, stripping Jammu and Kashmir of its limited autonomy. Overnight, the region was locked down, internet cut, leaders arrested, dissent criminalized. It was framed as integration. But integration without consent is occupation by another name. Meanwhile, Indian and Pakistani media continue to push nationalist narratives. Kashmiris are either heroes or terrorists, patriots or separatists. But rarely are they shown simply as people. People who want to live, love, study, work, speak freely and shape their own destiny. If there is to be peace between India and Pakistan, it cannot come through more tanks, more flags, or more agreements made in capital cities. It must begin with justice. And justice means listening to those who have been silenced for far too long. Kashmir is not a trophy. It is a homeland. And it belongs to its people. Not to Delhi, not to Islamabad, not to those who use it as a talking point while children grow up surrounded by barbed wire. In May 1998, the deserts of Rajasthan trembled as India detonated 5 nuclear bombs. Weeks later, Pakistan responded with 6 of its own. The world watched with bated breath as 2 of the most impoverished nations on earth entered the nuclear club. Not through technological marvel but through nationalist spectacle. For many in India and Pakistan, this was presented as a moment of pride. Mutual deterrence, they called it. Strategic parity. Politicians promised safety, prestige, and a permanent place on the world stage. But behind the rhetoric lay a darker truth. Nuclear weapons did not make either nation safer. They only raised the stakes of future violence. From a leftist perspective, the most troubling part of this nuclear standoff isn't just the risk of war, it's what it reveals about priorities. In 1998, both countries were still struggling with massive poverty. Tens of millions lived without clean drinking water, adequate housing, basic health care. Public schools crumbled. Rural economies collapsed. But suddenly there was money for missiles. Money for megatons. Money for mushroom clouds. In both India and Pakistan, the decision to go nuclear was not made by the people. It was made by elite security establishments, by generals, bureaucrats, and politicians who saw national prestige as more important than human need. The costs go beyond bombs. Since the 1990s, both countries have funneled billions into defense budgets. In India, defense spending now routinely eclipses social spending on health or education. In Pakistan, the military is not just an institution, it is an economic empire. It owns banks, factories, and real estate. It dominates foreign policy. It has become, in every sense, a state within a state. And what does the average citizen gain from this arms race? Nothing but anxiety. Every time tensions rise, every time Kashmir flares, the possibility of nuclear war returns, not as a distant nightmare but as a tangible fear. A miscalculation, a drone gone rogue, a border skirmish misinterpreted, these could all mean the end of cities, rivers, generations. Western powers, too, play a quiet role in this theater. The same countries that preach nuclear disarmament often profit from the militarization of South Asia, selling weapons, pushing regional alliances, and playing both sides in a delicate balance of power that keeps the subcontinent on edge. But most of all, nuclear weapons help entrench the status quo. They justify authoritarianism. They centralize power in the hands of military elites. And they provide the perfect excuse for silencing dissent. National security becomes a shield against criticism. Activists, journalists, and students who question war are branded as traitors. The message is clear. Don't protest, don't ask questions, and definitely don't imagine peace. Yet despite all this, ordinary people in both countries continue to resist. Artists, teachers, workers, and peace activists remind us that humanity cannot be measured in kilotons. That pride built on fear is no pride at all. That safety does not come from weapons but from justice, dignity, and dialogue. In a region haunted by partition and scarred by war, the nuclear standoff is not a symbol of strength, it is a symbol of failure. A failure to heal. A failure to learn. A failure to care for the living in the name of defending nations. Because what use is a nation, if the people it claims to protect are always one wrong step away from extinction? For over 75 years, the story of India and Pakistan has been told in the language of borders, armies, religions, and rival flags. But beneath that noise lies another story, one that doesn't make headlines but shapes the lives of hundreds of millions. A story not of Hindus and Muslims, not of India and Pakistan, but of workers and bosses, landlords and laborers, rich and poor. Because while politicians traded threats and armies marched at borders, farmers in both countries were crushed under debt. Workers in Lahore and Lucknow toiled for wages that couldn't feed their families. Children on both sides dropped out of school not because of war but because of poverty. The real divide in South Asia has never been between nations. It has always been between classes. In both India and Pakistan, the ruling elite quickly learned that nationalism could be a useful tool, not just to unify the nation but to pacify the people. Every time there was an economic crisis, a corruption scandal, or a mass protest, there was always a convenient enemy across the border. Fear became currency. And war became theater. Meanwhile, the billionaire class grew stronger. In India, a handful of corporate empires control everything from media to mining. In Pakistan, feudal landlords and military-linked businesses dominate the economy. The state, instead of challenging this concentration of power, protects it, often violently. In both countries, caste and class intersect to maintain old hierarchies. In India, Dalits remain disproportionately landless, poor, and oppressed, still facing systemic violence and exclusion. In Pakistan, religious minorities and lower caste communities like the Shiite and the Christian working class are exploited and forgotten. National identity is used to paper over these injustices, to insist that unity must come before equality. But people are not blind. From the textile workers of Faisalabad to the farmers of Punjab, from student unions in Delhi to feminists in Karachi, there have always been voices refusing to be manipulated by war drums. In moments of clarity, the people have marched for wages, not weapons. They have demanded education, not enmity. Even across borders, solidarity has emerged. Writers, musicians, and peace activists have risked state surveillance to connect with their counterparts across the divide. In defiance of the official narrative, they have shared poetry, resistance, and hope. But these moments of cross-border unity are always fragile, because they threaten the foundation of elite power. A worker in Mumbai and a worker in Multan have far more in common with each other than either does with their nation's richest families. That fact is dangerous. That fact must be buried. And so, the myth of eternal enmity must be kept alive. From a leftist perspective, the task is not to pretend that differences don't exist, but to ask, who benefits from our division? Who profits when nationalism replaces solidarity? Who stays in power when the poor are taught to hate each other? India and Pakistan were both born in trauma. But they will not be healed by more flags, more weapons, or more speeches. They will only be healed when the people of both nations see through the illusion of difference and recognize their shared struggle, not as enemies but as equals. Because in the end, borders don't feed the hungry. Flags don't build schools. And nationalism never fills an empty stomach. 75 years after partition, India and Pakistan remain locked in a dance of hostility. Each war, each crisis, each election season escalation renews the same narrative, that the other side is the enemy, that peace is weakness, and that nationalism is strength. But ask yourself, what has this hostility truly delivered? Not peace. Not prosperity. Not justice. Instead, it has delivered bloated military budgets, silenced dissent, and the normalization of fear. It has given us a politics where questioning the state is treason, where history is rewritten to glorify violence, and where ordinary people are treated as pawns in a perpetual game of national pride. And yet, despite it all, the people endure. They endure in the slums of Karachi and the busties of Delhi. They endure in the villages of Sindh and the fields of Bihar. They endure in factories, in classrooms, in homes built on hope and barely held together by wages. They endure curfews, crackdowns, blackouts, bans, and bombs, not because they are resilient by nature but because they are denied any alternative. But what if there were an alternative? What if peace wasn't a diplomatic soundbite, but a people's demand? What if solidarity was not limited by borders, but forged in the shared pain of poverty, repression, and exploitation? Imagine a subcontinent where the billions spent on weapons were redirected to clean water, rural hospitals, and public schools. Where railways carried workers to jobs, not soldiers to front lines. Where history was taught not as a myth of glory, but as a lesson in humility. Imagine a world where a Kashmiri child doesn't grow up under barbed wire. Where a Pakistani journalist doesn't disappear for asking questions. Where an Indian student isn't jailed for shouting slogans. Where no one is told to prove their loyalty with silence. This isn't utopian dreaming. It's historical necessity. Because the status quo is unsustainable. The climate is changing. Inequality is exploding. Young people are growing restless. They are asking why food prices rise while weapons budgets expand. Why temples and mosques are funded while schools rot. Why hate is rewarded while compassion is punished. If we want a different future, we must first change the story. A story where India and Pakistan are not eternal enemies, but co-victims of the same historical betrayal. A story where partition is remembered not as a triumph, but as a tragedy. A story where liberation is not national but human. And in that story, peace is not just possible. It is revolutionary.